Robin is the AERO's Interim Executive Director and previously was on AERO's board for 2 terms. She's based in Whitefish, Montana. She also owns a good seed company whose mission is to reestablish the community practice of selecting, saving, and sharing seeds for common use, and is a steering committee member of Free the Seeds, a program of Farmed Hands Nourish, providing community-powered opportunities to build a sustainable and resilient future through real seeds, real food, and real skills. So thank you, Robin, for being here, and you can go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, can I ask folks to just put your name and affiliation in the chat box so that we can get a record of the people who actually show up? Would be really great. Thanks so much. And so I am now going to share my screen. Thanks, Erin. Do you guys all see that screen that says resilient food systems? Great. Okay, so this comes out of a series of conversations that a number of us have been having since the pandemic hit, that we've just, for lack of a better term, called food access calls. And it's involved people who work in food access or food systems at any level to just share resources, you know, particularly during the early days when it just felt like the crisis felt stronger and immediate. And then as things have calmed down and systems have come into place, we've moved this into a biweekly conversation. And the purpose of that is really just to continue staying engaged and keeping tabs on what we're doing and sharing resources and just helping each other out. It's been very, very helpful. And just trying to decide whether to change the slide or not. So then this summer, Montana Organic Association has a lot of ranchers among its membership. And anybody who lives in Montana, does anything related to food, knows we've had an issue with meat processing, specifically highlighted by the pandemic. And the membership and the organization of MORE were really trying to figure this out, and they realized they realized a couple things of like, we don't really know what we don't know what our problem is or how to answer our questions. And so MOA just started a series of sessions to try to fill knowledge gaps. And it has been very successful for helping to educate and increase the knowledge base across a really broad cross sector of people who have interest in sustainable and resilient meat processing centers and systems in Montana moving forward. And it has now gotten to a point where they feel like they have enough knowledge and enough momentum that now it's going to spin off into a more systematic listserv, and some groups are taking action in particular areas, but it was incredibly effective for developing that knowledge base. And they did it with once a month sessions that ran about 75 minutes and just brought in different people to answer different questions. And one of the interesting things about it was, as everybody's knowledge increased, they became more sophisticated in their questions, and that guided the next topic that would come, that they would find a speaker to come and educate them on. So that evolutionary process was really effective and informative. And with our food access groups and calls, the question came up is maybe it would be helpful for us to formalize a little bit and do more of that knowledge gap filling. And so just to deconstruct what the more resilient meat processing series model ended up being, they didn't really plan it, this is just what was happening, is they identified a problem. And so the problem was we got problems and gaps in trying to process our meat in Montana. And they identified an audience. So who is the audience? The audience was who benefits from the solutions we can come up with. And in this case, it was primarily ranchers are looking for solutions that will solve their problems. And the questions that they were asking is what needs to be in place for us to be successful? And the knowledge gap that they discovered is some people had some knowledge and there was some knowledge that nobody had. And that's what informed the start of this series, of their series. And I had said to our food access people, okay, well, AERO will take the lead on doing this food system series launch. And as we started to do this expo and we listened to these conversations, particularly in the evening, these happy hour conversations, we discovered lots of new pieces of information, at least coming forward to my ears, that I did not know before about prior efforts that had been undertaken by different folks in different sectors of the food system that for any one of a number of reasons were no longer successful, and some of them that were. And there seemed to be a gap in knowledge as to the why one worked and one didn't. And then for those of you who may have attended the Grow Montana sessions, the morning session in particular, we got a very clear communication from Ken Mangold, who is our guide on legislative maneuvering for policy matters, that in order to be effective, to move forward with policy matters and be successful in getting any policy or bill passed, we need to be very succinct and clear in what our problem is, what the solution is, and what the cost is going to be. And so those pieces together helped me get clear on what it is that we can do with this session. So what I ended up deciding to do with this Food System Summit launch is to use it as a time for us to explore together some of these questions of problems, audience, and knowledge gaps, and use that to design the people we bring in moving forward. So maybe a smear. For example, I think everyone is very clear that another gap is the vegetable and grain mid-scale processing. We don't have enough of it in the state. And that's one of the policy priorities for Grow Montana, is to encourage the government to support that effort to have more of these in the state. One of the things that have come out of these sessions, as I mentioned, is there's information to unpack in the fact that there have been a number of efforts tried by for-profit enterprises and nonprofit enterprises and some cooperatives over the years. And a number of them have decided not to continue processing vegetables. And so that just asks the question, like, what is the information about the choice to close them? Why were they not viable? How do we make them viable? A big question was, how do we make, what's the gap in making them financially viable? And who are the audience? Who will benefit from the solution? Farmers, obviously, because they can sell their produce. The processors, they need to be able to make a profit. The buyers, they need to be able to buy the product and sell it themselves at a price that they can afford. And what does success include? I don't actually know, but from out of our evening conversations, one thing seems clear: stacking enterprises effectively seems to be important. Having relationships with institutional buyers seems to be important. So this is an area, for example, where if we can unpack this a little more and we can all have a common knowledge base on really what are the fundamental issues, if you unpack it, it can help us create a more effective definition of the problem, the solution, and the cost that we might want to present in a future legislative session. It's not going to happen next month, but and it can also help us just in our brainstorming and in our work together on food systems as we move forward. So that's just one example that's come out and it's become clear for me in as it relates to vegetable and grain mid-scale processing. And I suspect that there are others. Whoops. I skipped something, excuse me. So I had skipped a slide, forgive me. Here's just a sort of a nice overview picture of, what are our knowledge gaps. Out of the sessions that have come up in Expo, as I mentioned, vegetable and grain mid-scale processing turns out to have some issues that perhaps if we unpacked it, we could all increase our knowledge. Distribution, big issues there. There was just, we had some really interesting stories among independent grocers around the state, and the disparity in being able to get access to food in a pandemic during times of disruption. There were another series of conversations that came up and questions around the difficulty for food hubs. What is it that makes them hard to be successful? Where are their gaps? How if we could help unpack those gaps, how might we support food hubs being more successful moving forward? What's missing? And maybe there's others. There's probably lots of others, and that's what we thought we would cover in today's session. So for all of these, there's the opportunity to identify the problem, to identify the audience who benefits from the solution, to identify what needs to be in place for whatever this sector is or this activity is to be successful. And what else have I not mentioned so far? This is how I have synthesized and extracted information from the sessions we've attended these past 8 days. And I'm curious to see what other people who are on this call and who are thinking about this might think, or other questions that we would want to consider. And understanding that all of this is an evolutionary process. So when I gave you this example with MOA, the people on the call to begin with were pretty much all ranchers and other people who were just generally interested like myself. And as they unpacked the problem and increased their knowledge base, there was an understanding of more broader members within the food system who would benefit from a successful and efficient and effective meat processing program in Montana. And that actually includes relationships with tribal communities. It included working with cooperatives. It included working with entities that had stacked enterprises. And so other people started to come into the conversation that were not there at the beginning. And so understanding that even the problem can be, that we might identify today, can change and shift over time. So just allowing this to be a fluid process. Nonetheless, all that being said, there's value in starting. So I wanted to go into a breakup, but before we do that, I'm just curious if I'd like to open the conversation up to feedback or communication on, I'm going to get out of here. Why don't I get out of here? Because I like to see people. Just on what you've heard so far, is there what resonates from what's been shared so far, and what are some ideas that pop into your mind in terms of areas of focus in trying to unpack knowledge gaps in a particular area within the food system that perhaps you're familiar with?
Robin, we had a question come in from Mark Mackin in the chat. He asked, when you say vegetable processing, what do you mean? Packing at a farm level, or cutting and bagging or canning?
So in this context that I'm talking about cutting, bagging, and canning, processing, say, squash and freezing it, or yeah, the type of work that a lot of that Mission Mountain Enterprise Center does, for example, and that Montana Growers Co-op did for a while, things like that. How does any of this wash over you? Any thoughts? Here's a question from, hi, Kate. So Kate is asking a question about meat processing. Has the issue of concentrated animal feed operation, CAFO, been discussed? So in those meat processing calls, and I would invite you to participate in those directly, they're more interested, the ranchers that are on the call are more interested in smaller scale processing for their ranch quantity. So not doing a CAFO type system, but being able to process their animals in the region where they are. And if it's okay with you, I would prefer not to spend time on the meat processing, simply because that's been handled so effectively by the MOA series, which you can get access to any of those sessions on their YouTube channel, and I think and whatever handouts they had are also available on their website. It's just they have, that's where the detailed knowledge is on that, and I am not an expert on any of that at all. But I think what I'm trying to do in this conversation is invite participation in the thought process of where the folks who are here on this call might think that there are knowledge gaps in an area that relates to the food system. And I'm happy to move on, but I just wanted to create space for any ideas or thoughts that have come up so far from what I've shared up until now.
Robin, this is Tom Cheetah. I think what you've been absorbing over the AERO conference so far is great, and this is a great starting point, and I'm glad there's a discussion happening. The only other thing that comes to mind besides what you've mentioned already, and I'm not sure if it exactly falls in here, but rules and regulations come up for us a lot in our Food Hub discussion across farmers and ranchers, and Department of Ag versus county sanitarians, all that kind of conversation. And maybe it's just us who are having a hard time sometimes figuring it all out, but maybe it falls under processing, because that's where a lot of the questions come up. Mm-hmm. But who controls what, and who do you go to for what, things like that. Mm-hmm. Maybe another topic.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And so it's also it's a knowledge gap, So yeah, for you guys, sure. Yeah.
For us.
Yeah. And probably informs the choices that you make in trying to figure out how to be successful.
Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So I come at it from a consumer and as a person that wants to think, at a systems level about my community. And so what's the capacity of, the 60,000 people, within the Helena market, within a half hour of Helena, how much food goes through this community in a year? I think, I don't know, the grocery stores I think are proprietary, so it's kind of hard to get it, but what's the capacity? How much food is eaten here, and how much of that food, what market share could be captured by local producers? Is there any way to know that or figure that out, or start figuring it out? Does Commerce track that? Does Department of Agriculture track that? Is there a way to get that? It'd just be kind of interesting to know, do we have room for, how many producers do we have room for in Helena? How do we figure that out?
Mhm.
Anyway, that's
Yeah.
a gap. That's a knowledge gap.
Sure. Yep. And that actually probably impacts, that impacts lots of things. It could impact processing, it can impact one of the other topic areas that I found was quite rich was the locally sourced food restaurants. So it could impact that as well. And marketing seems to be important.
Yeah, there's a lot, so if there was a group of people that were envisioning what 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, let's say 5 years from now, how the food system would be better. And, there's a lot of ways you could go. You could say, well, it'd be better because we had 20 more producers and they were all surviving economically. But does that mean that that's all through CSAs or farmers markets? Or does that mean that we've gotten enough market clout that we can go to Albertsons and Safeway and say, can you carry local produce? And then the fights with the distributors that say to Safeway, we're not going to do business with you if you're not giving us all the shelf space. And so that's a whole nother, who even knows what that looks like, from a rule setting, entrepreneurial area. And I don't know if anybody that's in the field I know we heard the other day that the distributors can make the stores guarantee a certain amount of purchasing a month. And then they're not going to really, they don't want to serve you if you're bringing in their competitors. So that, how do you push back against that? That's
right.
I have no idea. And maybe other states are further down the road in figuring that out,
Yeah. So I would agree, and I'm hearing a couple things that I'm learning from what you're sharing, Max. To the last point, I agree. I think, for example, the distribution in Montana could be viewed as, okay, that's a subject area, and who benefits from finding the solution? Consumers do, farmers probably. And what needs to be in place. We don't necessarily know the answer to that, but we could explore what that would be for sure, because there's lots of pieces to it, as it turns out. And the other piece that I'm taking away from what you're saying, from your questions that hadn't occurred to me, is that exploring and unpacking whatever these sections are that we end up. I'm staring at the screen, and you guys are not. Whatever we end up, if we were to explore, do a series on processing and another one on distribution, there's information that probably would be beneficially, that learned through one inquiry would benefit providing information to another inquiry. For example, this piece you're talking about in terms of the capacity, the consumer capacity for locally grown food in Helena. There's value in that information being applied across different questions.
Right.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I can bring something to that. I think, I'm sorry I came to the discussion late, but I've spent a fair amount of time with a PhD student, Tommy Bass, thinking about local food systems and what are sort of the crucial factors involved with how do you define or how do you evaluate those systems, was really what the first question that came to us was, and we started to think about what the basis for evaluation is, number one, but if we restrict it to the quality of the food, the price of the food or the cost of the food to the consumer, and the balance of wealth throughout the system, and then the efficiency in the system, so the energy it takes. It starts to matter a lot how you bound the system. It matters how many people participate in the system as producers. It matters if you have distributors or not. And I'm not putting a value on those as being good or bad necessarily, but all I'm saying is that these are the kind of things that came into our discussion, and realize that the interaction among these factors is really important. So for example, if you wanted to assess whether some new restriction came into one of those nodes in this network of between producers and consumers, the nodes being processor, perhaps distributor, and then a retailer, and then the consumer, is if there's new rules on those, how does that change the look of that system in terms of these sort of response variables, I'll call them, the response in terms of the quality, the efficiency, etc. Really, those are very complex interactions, and not many people have looked into that. There's some Swedish academic groups studying that, and we've looked at their publications and whatnot. But it really comes down to these very system-specific kind of factors.
Mhm.
But it takes the knowledge gap is one of how do these things interact,
Mhm. Yeah.
and how might you bound a system? Is it just bound by what you have? In other words, you're in Helena, so who's the furthest producer away, and how big are they?
Mhm.
So that really counts as to how many producers you have, and how one big one can really throw things off, especially if they're close. But if they're far away, it kind of gets diluted by their energy inefficiencies.
Mhm.
I had a choice to buy some strawberries from Chile yesterday or from San Diego. And of course, I probably shouldn't be buying strawberries in December anyway, but there you go.
Right. So, and I mean, that would be beyond of what we might define as local when we bound our food system. But nonetheless,
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring to the fact that there's a bunch of interactions that are going to be complicated, and that it isn't maybe as simple as trying to tease out one part and just work with it, because it has to interact with these other parts. So I think that's the first lesson learned in that in how we address these food systems. And we specifically were looking for, are there rules of thumb that we could come up with about local food systems that make them sustainable, I'll call it, under these sort of aspects of balancing quality, energy efficiency, and shared profit throughout the nodes.
Right. Yeah, that's very valuable information. And just for anyone who may not know, Grow Montana has received funding to commission a study on the impact of local food in Montana. So that will hopefully will help inform some of the information that you're bringing up here, Max, which is really important. I mean, Bruce, sorry. I just want to note two things that came up here in the chat. One is from Coulter, who I actually don't see I don't see him here at the moment, but at any rate, he said, how do we reach out? Oh, there you are. Forgive me. How do we reach out to the new farmers and ranchers that are starting out? They have a lot of knowledge gaps that are really hard to fill until they make some connections, until someone takes the time to sit down and say organization XYZ or person ABC or website, whatever. Until then, us new guys are working more from a point of view of what we want to do as opposed to what works. So where the gaps are production, where are the gaps, what are the laws, etc. Be very helpful. Well, there you go. So, you know, that we could look at that as one of the boxes we might work on. And I'm going to invite you to do that, Coulter, in the breakout session as, you know, part of the food sector is production. And what's the problem? The problem is new farmers having the knowledge to not have to reinvent the wheel, you know, and who benefits it? The new farmers and everybody else who gets to buy their products. So I would invite you to explore that question in this in the breakout session, because that's exactly what I'm looking at here. Would be really helpful. Yeah. And then here's a note from Mark Mackin that says the Hutterites have managed to penetrate some conventional markets by producing packaged product in volume over time. And Calicrate and Moa, in the Moa meetings, talks involving municipal governments to provide a space and support for a local food system. It's one thing to close a street on Saturday morning. It's another to lease a covered and combined heated space for 5 years. Yeah. That's a true statement too. One of the things that Mike Calicrate mentioned in the MOA conference, and I think on another call, was an example in Melbourne of a very effective indoor marketplace that makes it easier to stack enterprises and makes it easier for producers and processors and consumers to all meet. And there are a bunch of questions I think to unpack for something like that to work in Montana. So like that would be great for someone to start to think about what is it that what are the knowledge gaps that we would want to answer so that we could bring together people to help answer those questions. So I'm going to go ahead and take us to the breakout session. And I'm going to ask you, let's see, did I do this correctly? I didn't. I'm just going to try to find my, here we go. I just need to copy this. Sorry, you guys are seeing all this. Okay, so I'm going to invite us all to go into a breakout session. We're going to break out into maybe 3 rooms. And I'm going to put these questions in the chat box. So I invite you to copy the chat box before you go into your breakout rooms. I'm not sure the chat box goes with you. Maybe it does. But I'm just looking from your lens as you, whatever it is that you're thinking about, that you have some reference point or you have a question about in the food system. Some of you are quite active in it and some of you are less so. Asking, you know, what is a gap? What is a knowledge gap in the food system now? And today, in this moment, how would you define the problem? Who do you see as the audience? Who would benefit from solving the problem? Just as it, you know, whatever comes clear to you right now. And in this moment, what do you think needs to be in place for that gap, for that sector to be successful? And what do you see to be the knowledge gap in order to solve the problem? And so it's just an exploration opportunity for you guys to engage among each other and just chat among yourselves and see what ideas come forward. And then we'll come back in about 15 minutes and share out what we're doing. I'm going to, as I said, I'm putting this in the chat box so you'll all have it. And I'm going to ask you guys to facilitate yourselves and give each other a chance to share. And those of you who are more comfortable facilitating, feel free to pick one of you to do that if you'd like. But, you know, just take some time to share and let's see what comes forward, and then we'll come back and talk about it, and that will help inform where we put our focus in this food system summit series that we're going to develop over the next couple months. Okay, so Erin, can you go ahead and make 3 rooms and give us about 15 minutes?
Yeah, I didn't get a message in the chat about the questions you wanted.
Oh, that's because I didn't push. There we go.
Great.
I forgot to push send. So there it is. You guys can all see in there.
Yes. Okay. Let's see. I'm just. Okay. Oh, there we go. No, I guess we're not.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Colter and I had a very passionate conversation. So we were mid-sentence when we came back. How was that for everyone else? Any comments? Good? Let me get out of here. I'm not sharing him, I know. What do I want to do? Well, before I write anything down, just anything anybody wants to share out from your groups?
I was volunteered to talk from our group. We had a good conversation about a couple things. One that came up first was, and I'm looking at the notes about the homework you gave us, Robin, about like gaps, especially knowledge gaps. And we talked about procurement and what that means for, especially like institutional maybe, and contracts, and like in our example with the food hub, on one side, procurement from farms, but then also our food hub supplying larger institutions like hospitals or schools, or and as far as I'm concerned, I have a big knowledge gap, and we as a food hub have a knowledge gap about the procurement systems that those organizations use and how the contracts work that they're already involved in with. I've heard things about how 90% Cisco contracts and they're only allowed to buy a little bit of local product. Like, I think that might be a good, something good to tackle. Then the other thing we talked about quite a bit was consumer advocacy, consumer knowledge, values of consumers. We learned in one of these evening sessions about that CSA program where folks were bringing food back to compost, and that grower was talking about how much she was seeing people wasting or not using as much as she thought they would.
Yeah.
We talked about composting systems in the state and how I know there's been a lot of attempts at different scales and different municipal systems, or private industry systems or whatever across the state. And another place where I think you could build a lot of knowledge about what is going on and what's been successful in the state and what's not, and what's been tried before. But that bigger consumer question is an interesting one. And we talked about that for a while and what it means. And is consumer education, smaller is not the right word, but is that something more that like the growers or like a small food hub co-op should be worried about, and this group's more worried about what's the right word, policy bigger ideas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to reflect back what I heard you say, because I thought I could type on the screen while I presented. It doesn't seem to work. So let me just tell me if what I heard was accurate. Procurement seemed an area, a knowledge gap, particularly with whatever the relationships are that the larger distributors, if you will allow in terms of how much local food they purchase for distribution versus other foods. And however we define procurement, there's lots of questions that could be identified for solving that knowledge gap. In your world, when you brought that up, what popped in terms of who's the audience we want to make sure is at the table in that conversation? Like who benefits from solving that problem?
Well, the farmers and ranchers, I think, obviously, but then also the end, like the patients in the hospitals or the kids in the schools who are then eating that good local food, I guess.
Yeah, parents who are concerned with what their kids are eating at school would probably be interested in knowing that my school has a contract with Cisco and 95% of all food served at my kid's school has to come from Cisco, because then the parents can bring it up to the parent whatever boards and say, you know, hey, we don't like this. We would like to support our local community, or we want our kid eating better. What can we do, right? Because if the pressure is just coming from the farmers and the sellers, from the school's point of view, they don't, it's just another vendor trying to sell, right? If the pressure is coming from their end customers, which is the parents' kid or the kid's parents, right? Then that's a different pressure that probably is more effective.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you have a connection.
Yeah, the institution's consumers, maybe something like that.
And I'm not a good one to add. I know there's probably a decent knowledge base for farm to school stuff and for some of the school things, but maybe the other kinds of institutions, like we talk about the hospitals over here a lot, and it's a really large scale. That's a whole another world, but there are a lot of other kinds of institutional questions when you talk about procurement.
Yeah, and there's schools have, you know, I'm now talking outside my realm of expertise by a long shot, so you know, take that with lots of salt. But my understanding is that schools have different budgets and they receive funds from different locations to buy, you know, money for that food that comes off the Cisco truck versus maybe you know, locally sourced beef or farm to school related stuff. So they're different budgets, different allocation, different concerns and considerations. So it's definitely an issue. So that's great. That's a great topic area. Another one that I heard you say is consumer advocacy and consumer knowledge, that helping, tell me if this is accurate. There's two pieces of that education or that knowledge gap. There's the producer's knowledge gap of what the consumer actually knows, and the consumer's knowledge of what they know about the food they're eating, or, you know, in terms of any part of it, whether it's care, how to cook it, or how to recover it, possibly. I don't know, is that an accurate sort of synthesis at a high level?
I think so. How does the rest of my group feel about some of this?
I can speak to that because I kind of brought that up. I think that's a good way of describing it. You know, like we have to know what people are eating now, and then if we want people to eat more local food, we need to inform them about what food actually is local, and then how to use that.
Yep. Fabulous. Yeah, this is great. So this is perhaps an aside, and I'm here to share it now. AERO, you may or may not know, we have an online directory that currently is a static directory. Listers can, any part of the food system, whether they're farmers or they're processors or they have a restaurant or a retail store, they can list on the site, and we're enhancing its capabilities so that they can now will be able to sell directly to consumers from the site if they'd like. But we're exploring the capacity to extend its functionality so that it is a much more dynamic and vocal promoter and coordinator of local food access across the state. So it actually acts more as a promotional food hub for resources relating to local food. And so I could see how gathering information about these gaps would help inform AERO's capacity to fulfill that role effectively, answering these questions about consumer knowledge gaps. And similarly, things like local food recovery systems. That is a huge opportunity, I think. Just food recovery and composting opportunities in the state. What does it take to have an effective composting program? What's the capacity? Yeah. What is the town? What are the towns? What's the population requirement? There's lots. That's a really great topic area with a lot of knowledge gaps. Another group, the other group that participated.
We just kind of kept coming back to, you know, like building, how do you build those relationships? So I think that topic's probably like a little too broad for a seminar, or, but, you know, you could kind of break that down in between. You know, we talked about like, what does it take to like sell the product? That could be one type of relationship, how to build that. Or, I mean, going out after what Tom said, how do you build a relationship with like an institution? And then I think we kind of drilled down into that more, even like building a relationship with the K-12 public schools can be different than a large hospital that might have like sustainability procurement goals. So that might have to be broken down more, but that's just what we kept coming back to, is that relationship piece is so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's as I'm listening to it, it also sounds like it could be, you know, a query in any topic area that we pursued for discussion. It's those interrelationships of how do you make them, how do you hold them, how do you enhance them, you know, what are the gaps that currently exist there.
Yeah, so maybe just holding space and whatever topics you do to talk about relationships and what's in, you know, how to build them.
Anything else from that group? Okay. In our group, which was Coulter and me, we talked about, so Coulter, as I understand it, is in the process of developing an integrated homestead, you know, with a lot of integrated and stacked enterprises, both from a market specialty crop production, growing, plus different livestock and specialty market items like mushrooms. So the idea of the integrated perennial and annual market vegetables and fruits and follow-on livestock to help with the health of the soil and all of those pieces. And in our conversation, we realized that, and anyone who has a longer relationship with AERO than I, please correct me if I'm wrong, but we've really not actually focused on that as a new farming enterprise to give attention to in terms of supporting the elements and the knowledge gaps there. You know, we've done mostly, I believe we've done mostly market farmers, ranchers, because it's a fairly new approach systems approach to growing, and a lot of our market farmers are only have vegetables. And anyways, it's there are a lot of questions that came up, a lot of questions that Coulter's already identified, and it seemed like that is a great opportunity for bringing people together to problem solve areas where they have knowledge gaps that can be of benefit both to the farmers and to the enterprises that they want to sell to, be they restaurants or co-ops or businesses. So I got very jazzed about that as a topic area to pursue. And please correct me if I'm wrong, that we've already pursued this as a focus area. Bruce, do you know whether we've historically done much work in that area, integrated systems for on a homestead?
I don't think so. I mean, there's
Yeah.
been some efforts around the state with, I think, centered out of NCAT perhaps, where they did some of these years ago. But I don't no, I think it's
too new,
even
right?
if they did revisit it.
Yeah, because it's too new. It's like, I think it's so great. It's so fabulous. So I am incredibly jazzed about that. So I feel like I'm doing a lot of the talking, and I have received a lot of useful information that will help inform what we do next. I'm just curious to hear from you guys if there's, any thoughts that you have from your experience today, or anything else you want to share from the work that you do elsewhere in your lives that you'd like to bring to the table today that might help inform the conversation. Okay, I mean, I'm perfectly happy completing if we feel complete. Just I want to thank you guys because you have helped informed this summit series for me as we plan and design it moving forward. And we'll be sure to let you know where we head first. And we may reach out to you if we have questions. And I'm very grateful and appreciative of your participation. And again, if there's anything you want to share, feel free, but otherwise we can call it complete for now.
I did just think of one other thing. With what I think Coulter had said about beginning farmers, like, is land access an area where we might want to, I know CFAC does a lot of work there.
Yeah.
But maybe bringing that, like, cooperative land access is like a new thing that's growing in other states, but we don't see as much here.
Mm-hmm. But that could be, that could be a session so that the knowledge base gets learned about from across the sector, and CFAC could be the presenters along, whatever else they suggest. It's a great idea. It's a great idea.
I would suggest that as you think about those elemental ideas, so for example, that you want land to be available to be able to produce for this local food system. It really could matter where that is relative to the other producers. And therefore, just having somebody willing to provide some land in itself might be plagued with problems in terms of actually becoming a sustainable producer. And it may simply be because of what it's, the conditions, let's say, of that site, or how if all you can produce is the same thing that several other farms really close by can produce, are you just setting up an ultra competitive kind of situation? So I think that there's there are considerations that go beyond just having land available.
Mhm.
And so, and I would hope that as that kind of discussion develops, that you think through, well, what are the things that could make this fail?
Yeah. So what I'm taking away from this dialogue here is that it's, part of what needs to be in place to be successful that would be included no matter what the question is seems to me, a common question to include in that is, in terms of food production in that area, what's the production capacity of that area, and how does that inform the number of farms that are reasonably appropriate for the area? And it seems to me like that question actually applies across a number of these topic areas, if you're really going to unpack it. So that's not necessarily something I had thought of off the top of my head. And because these conversations would have an evolutionary aspect to them, I'm hoping that those types of questions would come to the surface through the presentations themselves, as people get educated. So, but I think your point is very well taken, Max. Bruce, I keep wanting to call you Max.
That's okay. That's what my wife calls me.
So I just made a note of that. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else? Anything else?
I'll add one thing, and I don't know if this is useful or not, but I give a lecture in our 100 level course on food systems, and I usually start with this idea of thinking about what is a food system, what's it look like, and how do we maybe assess it. And I use a diagram. Can I get the ability to share my screen?
Yes.
Or do I have it? I might have it now. No, you have to
Aaron will make you a co-host, and then you will have it.
If you go down to your share screen and click on it, there's a place where it says allow others. Yeah.
Okay, you should be able to do it now.
Yeah, okay. So often I present, it's showing. I present something like this. This is this model of, let's say, a conceptualization of a food system where you have producers, processors, distributor, and then consumers. There could obviously be a retailer node as well. But what the point is that there's flows of things, and I'm showing flows of dollars between these. But there, again, it could be flows of product, or it could be simply be what the outcome is at the consumer, let's say, where I think that's kind of what we're focused on, and it could be quality, for example, of that food. But if we think about it in terms of a system like this, that there are different interactions that occur in it. In other words, a producer can go to a processor that then sends to a consumer, or there are producers that might directly sell to a consumer. But if you have these relationships in the system, how many producers do you need, or would you have before you saturate that system, or before you make it not possible? And part of the thing, the length of the arrows is kind of how far are producers away from that or in that system. So there's inefficiencies, for example, in that idea. So as we think about a system and how things interact in that system, we need to, usually the best starting point, and I'll go back to what I said when I first came into the meeting, and that is that we really have to think about what are the qualities of that system that we're really trying to accomplish. And is it strictly quality food, high quality nutritional food? And if that is, can we get at that? Can we actually know what is high quality versus not? In other words, how do I know that this producer gets higher quality to this consumer than perhaps this producer that goes to the processor, goes to the distributor, goes to the consumer? Or is that simply the time that it spends in the system, that it has to be lower quality because it takes longer? Similarly, we can say, who benefits here? Who makes most of the money in this system? And is that due to how much product flows through? Well, immediately you would say, well, the distributor's making most of the money. And that's what we see in our large food system. Larger the food system, the more the distributor makes the money. So is that a food system that we're trying to achieve? So what I'm pointing out here is that there are certain kinds of qualities that I think we really need to define about that food system before we can start to say, how should we design this? Or if we had the ability to just say, I'm going to create a local food system, what's that going to look like?
Mhm.
And I think part of that is recognizing that there's an evolution of a system. And as I said before, the simplest form is one where a producer produces to a consumer. And then maybe then you get a processor involved. Perhaps a producer gives to a processor and then they sell to the consumer. And then you have a couple of producers that are basically sending to a retailer, then to a consumer. And then it gets more complex over time. But those sort of evolve
Mhm.
through relationships.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's what Kaylee, I think, was getting at, is that there's an evolutionary process to these. Never does a community say, we want to have a local food system and we want this, this, and this. And then so go out and find people to do that. Or
Right.
rarely does that happen. So
Mhm.
it's usually this process, evolutionary process. And so given that context, how then do you start to achieve those qualities that you want in that food system? And when I say you want, I mean the community. Can the community agree on that? And that's part of the importance of the relationship through all nodes of that network that represents the food system. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. It is. It's another way, to me, what I take away when I listen to you is these are layers of considerations that would be present in unpacking probably any one of the conversations that could happen. And so, definitely a knowledge gap. And maybe some people have some of the knowledge, possibly it's knowledge no one has, I don't know. But just bringing it forward for conversation is what will allow, it moves the system forward with whatever the decisions are that, it helps move the system forward.
Okay.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else anybody wants to share?
Hey, Robin, I have a question for Bruce, if that's appropriate.
Sure.
Thanks, Bruce, for sharing that and your thinking on this. I'm curious what role you see MSU or MSU Extension or or the whole system playing in this conversation.
Well, I think we're trying to train students to think about these things and to elementally think, okay, here's the piece that I'm working on. And maybe this gets back to what Robin's trying to do in terms of identify, particular relationships in a system. But to think about how you fit into that system. And then when you make some decision about what you think you desire in that, how does that affect the other parts of that system that maybe you're not considering immediately in your immediate conversation? So how do we're trying to train students to think in that way and to be, one of our major objectives of our Sustainable Food and Bioenergy Systems degree program at Montana State is to create systems thinkers. And this is one of the ways that we sort of demonstrate that. And often you end up doing it with diagrams like this, so you can kind of visualize, okay, what are these different pieces? Clearly they're, you know, that they're oversimplified, but nonetheless, they are a place where you can communicate on those things. So I think that we are producing the kind of people that can add to the conversation, for sure. I think that probably more importantly, we're creating consumers that are desiring these kinds of systems. And so sort of through osmosis perhaps, but more than anything else, they seem to be very committed to quality food, and that seems to translate to the local production of that food. And I think they get that. So an example of one of our major retailers, and one that's right on campus basically, is Town and Country Foods. And they're locally owned. But one of the things that they've done that everybody seems to appreciate, and you see this in letters to the editor, et cetera, in the paper, is that they pay really close attention to their suggestion box. And if you suggest a product, they'll go get it and see if it sells. So they're very attentive to that. And people said, we want locally grown produce. So if they can get it, they'll buy it. If somebody walks in the door and says, I want to sell you the carrots, they'll almost always do that. They'll almost always make a piece of their shelf where it'll be local. So, you know, I mean, I think that was a relationship that was built a lot by, I think, students asking for it. You know, they're there to say, hey, we want this, and we'd like it affordable. and you know, TNC says, okay, we can suffer, you know, we can break even on that perhaps, because if it brings you into the store and you're going to buy other stuff anyway, it'll work out for us. So I think that's kind of an attitude, but that's a relationship that was built between the consumer and the retailer. So I don't know if I adequately answered your question, but I think we're producing more intelligent consumers and maybe more intelligent people that can think about food systems.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thanks. Yeah, I hope so.
So now we're really close to time. And my takeaway from that, Bruce, particularly that last piece, is, you know, a knowledge gap in a lot of this conversation, I think, marketing. And just even that, so this relationship between the consumer and the food seller, whoever that food seller is, you know, talking about it from a marketing perspective, it's something that's come up a lot. I've heard it actually quite a bit over the last 10 days. And anyways, so just a rethinking, a rejiggering of what we think of when we think of selling, or when we think of marketing, or you know, really it's all just about relationships. So it's, you know, that actually is a knowledge gap that could be included in any one of these pieces. So thank you very much for that.
Let me just share one quick story that I heard from a woman living in Chinook, where people, because of COVID, they don't want to go very far. They didn't want to go to Havre to buy food. And it's been totally rejuvenating of their local market. Their local market is really being attentive to what people want. And the interesting thing is they're even looking to supply with local products. And I think that's such a cool story, that a silver lining to perhaps this time. Anyway.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Do you know who that local market is?
I don't remember the name of it. I don't. I think there's only one.
Yeah, I probably tried to
So
find it.
if you look up, yeah, a grocery store in Chinook, you'll probably find it.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Great. Anything else anybody wants to share before we close the session out? Okay, well, again, it has been a very rich conversation. I have received tremendous value from it. I hope you all have gotten value as well. And thank you for attending. We have our last food system related happy hour tonight, which is food pantries and food banks. And then tomorrow night is the last one for the session, for the expo. And that is an interview between John Brown and Bob Quinn about the subterranean greenhouse that Bob Quinn is building. Tomorrow morning, we have a morning coffee session on community harvests and the impact they're having on building relationships and solidifying relationships among community members and farmers and grocers, and just that whole value of building that network. And from 1 to 2:30, we have our final topic session, which is Steve Thompson from NCAT talking about the intention to create a resiliency corps for the state of Montana to help address community resiliency at any level. So, okay, thanks so much for joining. I hope you'll attend one of our other sessions, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Robin.
Yes, bye-bye.